There's a place under Pennsylvania where the maps simply stop. Not because no one drew them, but because the men who could have drawn them never came back up to finish the work. For more than a century, the anthracite country of the Northeast, the ground beneath Scranton and Wilkes-Barre and the little river town of Pittston, was cut open. From the inside, men went down in cages and on foot, following seams of the hardest, cleanest coal on the continent, and they did not follow those seams gently. They chased them. The coal did not lie flat and polite the way it does in the western part of the state. Up here it tilted, it dove, it folded back on itself and plunged toward the center of the earth at angles that would make a man dizzy just to stand on, and so the mines that followed it were not tidy horizontal tunnels. They were staircases going down into the dark, level after level, each one deeper and hotter and quieter than the last, until you reached the bottom of everything a company was willing to pay for. And at the very bottom, at the deepest working face any man had reached in that particular ground, there was always a last beam, a last place where someone had decided the risk was no longer worth the coal. This is the story of what waited on the other side of that beam. To understand it, you have to understand what these men were actually walking into, because it was not like anything most people picture when they hear the word mine. By the middle of the 20th century, the northern anthracite field had been worked so thoroughly for so many decades that the ground under those towns was hollow. Not partly hollow, hollow beneath the streets and the churches and the schoolyards. There was a second world, an inverted city of tunnels and chambers and abandoned galleries stacked one on top of another, some of them from companies that had gone bankrupt 50 years before, some of them flooded and almost none of them mapped with anything you could trust. A miner going down to a fresh face at the bottom of an active mine was not just digging into solid rock. He was threading a needle through the ruins of everything that had been dug before him. Above his head, sometimes only a few dozen feet above his head, were old workings full of standing black water that had been sitting in the dark since before he was born. Everyone knew the water was up there. Everyone had heard the stories of a pick going through the wrong wall and a wall of that dead water coming through like the end of the world. The deeper you went, the more of that history was stacked above you, and the more careful you had to be, and the less room you had to be careful in. And then there was the river. The Susquehanna runs right through that valley, wide and slow and heavy, and the coal did not stop at the riverbank. The seams ran straight. Out under the riverbed, thousands of tons of the best anthracite in America lying there under all that moving water, and the companies wanted it. Of course they wanted it. The rule, the sacred rule, the rule that had been paid for in men's lives more than once already, was that you left a certain thickness of solid rock between the top of your workings and the bottom of the river. That rock was called the roof, and under the river it was the only thing in the world holding back the entire Susquehanna. You did not mine into it. You did not thin it. You did not, under any circumstances, chase a rich seam upward toward the water just because the coal was good and the quarter was ending and someone in an office wanted a better number. The rock over your head under that river was not roof. It was a lid on a coffin the size of a valley, and you were inside. Now hold both of those things in your mind at once. The hollow, drowned world stacked above every deep working, and the river waiting on the other side of a roof that was never supposed to be touched. And you begin to understand why the deepest shafts had a last beam, and why the men who worked near it did their jobs with a particular kind of silence. They were not afraid of the dark. They had been in the dark their whole lives. The dark was home. What they respected, what kept their voices low, was the weight. Everything above them was weight. The rock was weight, and the old water was weight, and the river was weight, and the whole ruined history of the mine was weight, all of it balanced on timbers cut from trees, on pillars of coal left standing here and there on the judgment of men who were paid. By the ton and not by the hour. At the bottom of the deepest shaft, at the last face any company would fund, that balance was at its most delicate. One more room, one more heading, one more push past the last beam, and you might find another fortune in coal. Or you might find the reason the beam was the last one. The men who worked those bottom faces were a specific kind of miner, not the young ones, and the young ones were kept higher up in the safer galleries, where a mistake cost you a hand and not your life. The bottom belonged to the old hands, the ones who had spent 30 and 40 years underground, who could read a ceiling the way a sailor reads the sky, who knew by the sound of the roof talking to itself whether they had 10 minutes or 10 hours. These were men who had buried friends. Every one of them had carried a body up out of that ground at least once, and every one of them knew that the mine kept a ledger and that no man worked it for a lifetime, without eventually appearing in the accounts. They went down anyway. They went down because the coal was there, and because after so many years, underground a man does not entirely belong to the surface anymore. The light hurts his eyes. The open sky feels wrong, too big, unsupported, like a roof that isn't there. So he goes back down to the only ceiling he trusts, the one he can reach up and touch, and he works his way toward the bottom, toward the last beam, toward the edge of the map. Edge of the whirlpool that had formed in the middle of the Susquehanna, a spinning black funnel of river pouring down into the mine. They pushed in whole gondola cars full of rock and rubble, mine cars, anything heavy that might catch and hold and build a plug in the throat of that whirlpool. For days, the river swallowed everything they threw at it. The whirlpool spun, and the water went down, and the men below stayed below. Eventually, after they had thrown enough of the world into the hole, the flow slowed and stopped, and the plug held. But the mine was gone. The deep workings were full of river to the roof, and they would never be pumped out, not ever, because the ground was too broken and the water table had changed forever. The bottom of that mine, the last shaft, the last beam, and everything past it was sealed under the Susquehanna, and the 12 men were sealed with it. They are there still. They were never recovered. They are down there right now, tonight, while you listen to this, in the cold and the dark under the moving river, exactly where the ground and the greed left them. That single day did something that no one at the time fully grasped. Standing at the edge of the whirlpool, watching railroad cars disappear into the river. It ended the deep mining, not just in that mine, in the whole northern field. The great tradition of chasing anthracite down into the earth, the thing that had built those towns and filled those churches and killed those men across 100 years, simply stopped because after the river came in, there was no pretending anymore that the balance could be trusted. The hollow ground had finally been proven hollow. The lid had come off the coffin. And so the deepest shafts, the ones that had reached furthest down toward the center of everything, were abandoned where they stood with tools still in them with lunch pails. Still on ledges, with the last beam still standing at the bottom of the dark, holding up a ceiling that no living man would ever look at again. That is the real answer to the question the legend asks. What did the last miner find past the last beam? He found the river. He found the thing the rule had always been about. He found the reason there was a rule. Every rule in that mine had been written in blood, and the men knew whose. Decades before the river came in another part of the same anthracite country, there had been a mine with only one way out, a single shaft that also served as the mine's only source of air, with a wooden breaker building constructed directly over the top of it. On a September morning, the furnace that pulled fresh air through the workings set the shaft, lining on fire, and the fire climbed the one and only exit. And it took the breaker with it, and it sealed more than 100 men in the ground below with no second door to run for. They did not die in a collapse or a flood. They died waiting, in the dark, for air that the fire above had turned to poison, while rescuers on the surface could do nothing but wait for the shaft to cool. When men finally went down, they found the miners where they had gathered near the bottom, some of them with their arms around each other, a father and his own son among them, and the whole nation read about it and was sickened by it. And out of that single horror came the first real mine safety laws in the state. The law that every mine must have a second exit, so that no group of men could ever again be sealed into the earth by one accident at one door. That is why the deep shafts had more than one way out. That is why there were escape routes and traveling ways and rules about ventilation and timbering and the thickness of the roof under the river. Not because the companies were kind, because men had already died in the way each rule was written to prevent, and their deaths had been public and unbearable, and the living had refused to let them mean nothing. But the legend is older than that one winter day. And it is bigger, and to leave it there would be to miss what the story is really trying to tell you. Because for every documented disaster with a date and a headline and a list of the dead, there were 1,000 smaller moments underground that no one ever wrote down. Moments when a single miner at a single face made a single choice at the edge of the map, and either walked away from it or did not. The ground is full of those moments. It is full of men who tapped a wall and heard water and set down their tools and walked out and never told anyone why they had stopped working a rich face, because you did not talk about the sound of rain 1,000 feet down. It was bad luck to talk about it, and worse luck to have heard it. It is full of men who felt the roof tighten, felt that particular pressure change in their ears and their chest that meant the weight above was shifting, and who got their crew out over the protests of the boss and were called cowards for a week, and were alive for another 30 years. The deep shafts are haunted, if they are haunted by anything, by all the decisions to stop. All the last beams that stayed the last beam because a man was wise enough or scared enough or tired enough to leave the fortune on the far side of it and go home to his family instead. And they are haunted, too, by the ones who did not stop. This is where the real weight of the story lives, heavier than any ghost. Because the mine did not only kill men who made mistakes, it killed careful men, it killed wise men, it killed men who had done everything right for 40 years and then went down on an ordinary morning to an ordinary face in the ground, for reasons no one could have read in advance, simply decided that this was the day. A roof that had held for a decade let go in a second. A pillar of coal that 100 men had walked past 1,000 times crumbled without a sound and brought the ceiling down. Old water in an old working that no map showed, that no living man knew was there, found a crack and came through. The deep shaft did not require you to be foolish to die in it. It only required you to be there. And the men knew that. That is the thing that separates them from us, the ones who have never worked underground. They went down, every single day, into a place they knew, with total certainty, would eventually kill some of them, and possibly all of them. And they did it, not once in a moment of bravery, but 10,000 mornings in a row, kissing their families and walking to the shaft in the dark before dawn and getting into the cage and dropping down into the weight. There is no braver thing that ordinary people have ever done for money, and they were never called brave because bravery was assumed and unremarkable, and the same as showing up. So when the legend asks what the last miner found past the last beam, it is asking something deeper than what physical thing waited in the dark. It is asking what a man carries to the very bottom of his working life, to the deepest and furthest point he will ever reach, and what he finds there about himself. And the answer the old miners would give you, the ones who lived long enough to sit on, porches in those valley towns with black rings tattooed permanently into the scars on their hands, the answer is quieter than any monster and more frightening than any flood. What you find past the last beam is that the ground was always going to win. Not today, maybe, not this face, but eventually, over a long enough time, with enough men going down enough mornings, the ground takes what it is owed, and no amount of skill or caution or prayer changes the total, only the order. The last beam is not the edge of the danger. The last beam is the place where a man finally admits, all the way down in himself where he does not say it out loud, that there was never a safe distance. There was only distance he had not crossed yet. And still they went down. That is the part that ought to stay with you. Knowing all of it, every man of them knowing the ledger and the weight and the river and the old dead water waiting in the dark, they got up before the sun and they went down anyway, because the coal fed their children and because a man is more than his fear and because somewhere in the human animal there is a thing that will walk toward the weight rather than let the people it loves go without. The deepest shaft under Pennsylvania was not conquered by heroes with names we remember. It was reached one careful foot at a time by thousands of ordinary men whose names are on no monument, who left no maps of the bottom because the bottom killed the map makers, and who understood better than anyone that the reward and the catastrophe are the same direction, that the fortune and the grave wear the same face, and that the only way to reach the one is to walk straight at the other. They walked at it every day. Most of them walked back. Some of them did not. And the ones who did not are still down there, past the last beam, under the river, in the cold and the permanent dark, at the bottom of a hollow world that swallowed them and closed over and now lies quiet under the towns and the churches and the ordinary streets, where their great-grandchildren drive to work without ever once feeling, beneath the pavement, the drowned cathedral of everything their people gave to the ground. The mines are closed now. The great companies are gone. The whirlpools are still. The shafts are capped with concrete and forgotten. And the towns have learned to live on top of the emptiness their ancestors dug. But the water is still down there. The old, flooded workings still hold their black and ancient water, level and patient in the dark. The river still runs over the sealed hole where 12 men wait. And somewhere at the very bottom of the deepest shaft, where no light has fallen in more than half a century and no light ever will again, the last beam is still standing, still holding up its small piece of the ceiling, still marking the exact place where the men decided that the coal past it was not worth the price the ground would ask. It is the truest border on any Pennsylvania map, and it appears on none of them. It is the line between what a man will take from the earth and what the earth will take back. And every one of us, in our own way, on our own ground, in the deep shafts of our own short lives, is walking toward a last beam of our own, chasing something rich and dark and precious that lies always in the same direction as the thing that will end us, telling ourselves there is a safe distance, knowing somewhere underneath that there is not, and going down anyway, in the dark, because the people we love are cold and the coal is real and a man is more than his fear. That is what the last miner found past the last beam. Not a monster, not a treasure, a mirror, and the courage, which was never called courage, to look into it and pick up his tools and keep working toward the bottom of the only life he had, one careful swing at a time, until the ground was ready to close the account. They knew, they always knew, and they went down anyway. Remember them. Consider what the descent itself was actually like, because the surface imagination softens it, and it should not be softened. The cage that carried the men down was an iron platform in an open shaft, and it did not lower them gently. It dropped. The operator released it, and it fell down the shaft, with the men standing shoulder to shoulder inside it. The walls of rock rushing up past the bars, the air changing in their ears, the light of the surface shrinking to a coin and then to a star and then to nothing, the temperature climbing because the deeper earth is warmer, so that a man who had left a freezing winter morning at the top arrived at the bottom into a wet, close heat, sweating before he had swung a single tool. Then the long walk in. The bottom of the cage was not the bottom of the work. From there the men walked, sometimes for the better part of an hour, stooped under low roof, through the water that always stood in the deep galleries, their lamps throwing small circles of light onto rails and timbers and the endless black walls, until they reached the face where the coal was being taken. And only then did the work begin, the actual labor, in the heat and the dark, at the far end of a journey that had already carried them further from the sun than most human beings ever go. They did this in the morning to go to work. They did it again in reverse at the end of the shift to go home, exhausted, the cage hauling them back up toward a daylight their eyes had half forgotten. Twice a day, every working day, for a lifetime. The deepest shaft was not a place they visited. It was a place they commuted to, down through the drowned history of everyone who had gone before them. One sound he has spent 40 years praying he would never hear. And then there is a choice. And the choice takes no time at all, because there is no time. Which way is up? Which way is out? Where are the others? Some men run for the slope, for the long climbing tunnel that leads to the surface, and some of them make it, water at their heels, and some of them are turned back by a wall of it and have to find another way, and do not find one, in time. Some men go the wrong direction entirely, deeper, because deep is where they have spent their lives, and the body goes where the habit sends it. And some men, and this is the part that the survivors carried for the rest of their days, some men turned around and went back down toward the